Good afternoon, everybody. Chief Meteorologist Brad Panovich here. If you missed the winter outlook last night, this is your chance to view it again, but also ask some questions. We're going to recap what we talked about last night. We'll get into some of the finer details that we didn't talk about in my winter forecast this year, but I always think it's important to start with what is normal or average for our area. So I use this chart every year. I update it every year. Our records go back to 1878 here in the Queen City. We're pretty lucky to have a long stretch of weather records. And over that time, if you take all the snow that has fallen since the first recordings there in 1878 to currently, that 145-year average is 5.5. But in climatology, we use 30-year averages. So every 10 years, we update that 30-year average. So the current 30-year average, which is considered normal, is from 1991 to 2020. It'll be updated in 10 years. So in 2030, you'll see it shift ahead another 10 years. That average is down to 3.5 inches. So that's our current average snowfall. So whenever you hear me talk about above and below average, that's the number to think about, 3.5 inches. But in the last 10 years, it's been even worse. 2.1 inches has been our average. And this year, we're talking about El Nino. And I always like to look at how El Nino or La Niña, or in this case, some years La Nada, which is a neutral phase. It's neither of those two. How we see the snowfall line up. Since 1950, which is when we first started recording El Nino data, El Nino years, 5.6 inches. You can see that is way ahead of the La Nina years. That's important. That's almost 1.5 inches higher than La Nina years. And that's important because the last 3 winters, we had La Nina, which is typically dry and warm. And certainly the last couple of winters have really paired that out. In fact, last year was the first snowless winter in Charlotte in that 145-year record keeping. And all that time, we had never had a year where we had less than a trace. A trace happened 11 times. Every other time we had measurable snow. So last year was the first year we didn't even get a trace. That means 0.0. So that was a rarity. That doesn't happen very often. That's why the confidence in this year that we're going to see at least something is up there, but El Nino is a big player. So if you missed our forecast from last night, let's recap it. We'll show you my winter weather outlook from last night. In Charlotte, our winter weather records go all the way back to 1878. But just in the past 30 years, our average snowfall has declined all the way to 3.5 inches of snow. We never win a year without 0 snow. That was until last year. For the first time in 45 years, we ended up with 0 inches of snow in Charlotte, and it was one of the warmest winters we had on record. That was in part because we were coming out of 3 straight La Nina patterns, which typically mean warmer and drier than average conditions here in the Southeast during our snow season. Now, this upcoming winter is bound to be vastly different because of El Nino, and not just a typical El Nino, possibly a historically strong El Nino. Now, El Ninos on average mean we get above average rainfall here in the Southeast because of that active southern branch of the jet stream. We also tend to get below average temperatures. But a word of caution, that doesn't always mean snowfall. It could mean a lot of cold rains with 40-degree temperatures. But there's some bad news for cold and snow this upcoming winter. For one, we have retreating Arctic sea ice in the northern hemisphere. We've already had below average snowfall this fall over in parts of Siberia. We have record warm water temperatures in the northern hemisphere. And all this means is that there's just not enough cold air around for snowfall this year in the northern hemisphere. Because of that active storm track in El Nino, I'm going to forecast above average precipitation here in the Southeast. That means all types, even rain. There'll be a lot of cold rains. Because of that rain and that active storm track, probably going to see slightly below to near average temperatures across the Carolinas. Let's start in Boone. I'm going to forecast 44 inches up in the mountains this upcoming season. Now that is above average and definitely more than we got last year. As you move down into the foothills, I'm going to forecast 7 inches of snow for parts of the Hickory area. That's slightly above average, but a lot more than last year as well. Last but not least, we're going to go to the Charlotte area, the Piedmont. We're going to see 4 inches of snow. I know that doesn't seem like a lot, but that's slightly above average now and a whole lot more than the 0 that we saw last year. So I definitely think we're going to have a wet winter. I think the big question everybody always wants to know, is it going to be snowy? It certainly can't be as bad as last winter when we got 0. So any snow at all this upcoming season certainly will be a benefit to all you snow lovers. All right, so that was the forecast. That was kind of the nutshell, but I wanted to summarize it because sometimes you see all that, what's the bottom line here? So, for temperatures this upcoming winter, the forecast that I'm going with is near average, but you heard me talk about maybe slightly below. The big caveat here is typically in El Nino winters, it's cold and wet, but this year, the wet part is a much higher confidence. And that's why when you look at the precipitation, which remember includes rain, snow, sleet, includes everything, basically how much liquid precipitation are we going to get at the end of the year? I'm going well above. And there's a really high confidence in that because El Nino winters, you tend to get an active storm track. So I think the highest confidence by far is in that storm track and the amount of moisture, which by the way is great news for the drought. We see this El Nino pattern kick in, hopefully starting maybe later this month in December. That would help eliminate the drought. Snowfall wise, we're going near average. It's tempting to go way above for snowfall in an El Nino winter, but the problem is there just is a huge lack of cold air across the northern hemisphere. Sea ice is retreating. There's not as much snow in parts of Siberia and Eurasia. So there is cold air up there. There always is, but it's the amount. The reservoir is not big enough to put down huge amounts of cold air. So when we get cold air, there'll be short, quick bursts of cold air. But because of that active storm track, that's why I do think we'll see a good chance for a couple storms. And as far as ice, got to watch this ice setup. I have it near average right now, but El Nino storm tracks tend to have a lot of shallow cold air trapped against the mountains. The cold air wedging, we call it. So you always worry about ice. So we're expecting a wet winter, but temperatures likely near average, even maybe slightly below, depending on how much rain. The thing I always tell people, you can get 40 degrees in rain around here. That's not snow, but that's still below average. The lowest our average high goes during the winter is around 52 degrees. So high temperatures in the 40s would actually be below average. So let's talk about El Nino. You hear me reference that a couple times. I want to show you what that storm track typically looks like. We'll pop it up here, and you can see the typical El Nino, which remember is warm water in the Pacific. What it does, that warm water in the Pacific ends up giving us a very active Pacific, or what we call subtropical jet. Now, the subtropical jet has a lot of moisture, but also has warm air. If you can get cold air to sync up with it, that's when you see the big snowstorms in the southeast. When these jet streams do something we call phasing, where you get the jet stream from the south and the north syncing up for one big storm, you get the combination of all this tropical moisture or deep moisture, and you also get the cold air. The problem is oftentimes they're separated, so we'll get the subtropical jet, we'll get rain in here, and we'll get those 40-degree cold air masses, which aren't enough to produce snow, but oftentimes can produce some miserable cold rains. And for that reason, that's why I think the mountains might end up benefiting the most from this, because if you're in the 40s here in the Piedmont, if you just go up a couple thousand feet in elevation, you can get just cold enough for it to be snow. So the mountains stand to gain from this as well. They probably are going to see a snowy winter. And when you saw my forecast, I actually went above. My concern though is the water here over the Atlantic and the Gulf of Mexico, and honestly the Pacific, is all way above average. So if you get a storm here that pulls in moisture, it's not only going to pull in the moisture, it's going to pull in that warm marine air. And depending on the storm track, it could push the warm nose, we call it, really far inland, which would really kill any chances for a lot of wintry weather. So if you're wondering why I didn't go higher with our snow totals, that's part of the reason why. Let's get to the snow and ice forecast, because I didn't show you the map earlier, but I will show you. This is kind of what I'm thinking. I'm showing below average snowfall here to the east. The gray area is near average. And then in the mountains, I'm actually going slightly above average, because just that slightly cooler air in the North Carolina mountains could be enough to push their totals over the top. And let's face it, last winter wasn't just a year with zero snow in Charlotte. Many areas in the mountains saw all-time low snowfall amounts. Some areas never got near double digits, and a lot of the ski resorts were actually forced to shut down early. So just a horrible setup for the snow season up there. We'll recap my checklist, and I'll kind of show you some of the things we look at. El Nino, La Nina phase, definitely one of those things should be strong. There, we're missing a G. So that usually means cold and wet. Near average snowfall in Siberia usually means warm and wet. Arctic sea ice near record lows. Also the lack of snowfall in the northern hemisphere, warm and wet. And then climate change and really high sea surface temperatures, warm and wet. So typically that would be a warm and wet winter, but we're kind of wondering if it'll end up being right on that borderline. So if there's one area where we'll bust on this forecast, it would be on the warm side. I think the wet part is probably the highest confidence, like I said, in the entire forecast. So let me show you those totals again. And again, these will never be exactly right. I do this more for fun and just so people have an idea on some totals, because it's like picking the winner of the Super Bowl. It's one thing to pick the team that wins. Picking the exact score is really, really difficult. So it's easier for me to say above and below average, but this is more just for fun. So in Boom, the 30-year average for snowfall is 25.6 inches. This year, I think we could be north of 40 inches. So that would be above average. So the mountain's certainly above average. Hickory, your 30-year average is right around 6.9 inches, which is essentially 7 inches. I'm going pretty close to that, which is just slightly above. Same story for Charlotte. Our 30-year average is 3.5. I'm going 4, which is basically right around average. So you see, outside of the mountains, I'm going close to average. And in the mountains, the one area that could overperform. So that's why you're seeing those differences. So let's get to some of those questions out there. I know James in the booth there has got some of the questions. We solicited some on social media when we posted yesterday. We got some of those. We'd love to hear your questions. If you have some, throw them in the chat. I do have my chat up here somewhere, and we'll try to see if we can show them. But we'll pull them up full screen here in a minute, and we'll see those questions. Get a little delay on my end, so I can't see them initially. So we'll pull up these questions. Our first question, okay, this is from Jackie. There are a couple of graphs in there. This is the map I just showed, by the way, with different colors. We're in the gray. What does that mean? So I'll go back to that map real quickly and kind of show you these maps. So gray is our base map. So if you're in the gray, that means you're not above or below, you're near average. So anytime you see gray on the map for our climate outlooks, for our maps at all, that's just the basic map. So that's the underlying map. That means near average. And if you're wondering what average is, somewhere in the low 40s for an average temperature for the entire winter. That's the highs and lows, and average snowfall about 3.5 inches. So when you hear average, that's what we're talking about. So great question there. We get that quite often sometimes with these maps. And you'll see it with the temperature map as well. I'll throw the temperature map up here real quickly. Above average temperatures on the coast, near average for the Piedmont, and the mountains would be the one area where we could be slightly below. So what's our next question? Throw it up here. I'm a little delayed in here, so I'm not seeing them in real time. So as soon as I see it, I'll answer them. So here's our next question. Andrea, thank you for this question. Unless I'm misunderstanding the winter forecast or predictions, it sounds like a toss-up. Actually, no, it's not a toss-up at all. In fact, we're going wet and near average temperatures. So I think toss-up means like we don't know. Let's be honest, it could go anyway, but based on the forecast is wet and near average for temperatures and for snowfall. So not really a toss-up. In fact, the wet part is probably the highest confidence I mentioned. There's a 65% chance of a moderate to strong El Nino, and there's a 35% chance it's historically strong. Those are really high numbers for El Nino. In El Nino, every single El Nino winter we've had has had a wetter than normal winter season, and that includes the winter through the early spring. So even think about early March into April. And the one thing I will tell you about El Nino winters, don't look for this to be like right away in December. Oftentimes they're late arriving. And when I look at some of the long range guidance, the seasonal guidance, there is a little hint that December could be at or slightly above normal for temperatures and maybe a little drier. And then January, February, March is when it gets cool and wet. So it might be one of those backloaded winters that we sometimes get around here. But good question. Not a toss-up. We know it's going to be wet for sure and likely near average for temperatures. Our next question. So great question. So this is what everyone's asking right now, right? Like, when are we going to see the above average precipitation? Let me throw that map up here real quickly. So when are we going to see this start to develop, the El Nino pattern? Well, funny you should say that, Nicole, because it does look like maybe closer to the end of this month into December, we're starting to see that storm track start to kick in a little bit. I don't think it's going to happen right away. It may be a slow arrival of that storm track, but I do think we'll see above average precipitation start to develop as we get closer to the beginning of December, and for sure by the time we get into early January. Now, that would be great. It's going to take about 6 to 7 inches of rainfall over a 1 month period to put an end to the drought. So we need this to kick in. That's why the well above average rainfall is really important. If we get rain, people will automatically assume, hey, the drought's over. No, if we get rain, we don't need the normal rain. We need normal rain plus the deficit. So you got to make up for the rain you missed out on. So over a single month, the average rainfall is, like 3 to 4 inches. Well, you got to double that up because you got to make up for the deficit for the past couple of months. So thanks, James. We're getting our questions here. So great question. Hopefully that'll kick in soon, but don't be surprised if it's a little delayed. There's more confidence that will kick in January, February, March. And that's the thing about El Nino. Oftentimes people say, we're in El Nino, that means it's going to be wet. It really only affects the winter and the cool season. So late fall, winter, and early spring. It doesn't have an impact really on our summer season at all. So great question. What's our next question here from Brian? When was the last El Nino year? That's a great question. So looking back at the El Nino pattern, it's been about 5 years since we've had an El Nino. And the last real big El Nino that was kind of referred to as a super El Nino was back in the late 90s, early 2000s. So we really haven't had, remember, we came out of 3 La Nina patterns. Before that, we had a La Nada or neutral phase. So it has been a while. It's been about 4 or 5 years since we've had a weak El Nino. A strong El Nino, it's been over a decade plus. So it's been a while. In fact, we really haven't had a cold and snowy winter in the last 10 years. So we are, I don't want to say we're overdue because that's not really the way things work climatologically, but it has been a long time since we both have had a cold and a wet winter. And I will tell you this too, oftentimes a wet winter is much better for snow lovers than a cold winter. Some of our coldest winters around here are cold and dry. The wet winters tend to do better because you have the active storm track, and they sometimes end up being warmer because if it doesn't snow, like I said, it pulls in that warm air from the Atlantic and from the Gulf of Mexico and overall gets you warm. The thing about snow in the Carolinas, if you're a snow lover, and I know there's a lot of you out there, I love snow, it's never consistently cold here. That's not the way our winters work. The way we get snow here is the cold air and moisture time up for a couple days, like a 3 or 4 day period. Typically, the cold air comes in first, establishes the cold air, and then the active storm track comes in on the backside. But if you're looking for like days and days of temperatures in the 30s, that's really, really rare. That's why last winter, even though it was very warm, we had that 1 week around Christmas. That was pretty rare to see consistent cold for that 1 week. And that was like the whole winter because after that week was over, it was back to warm air. So good question there. Next question we got, let's see. You're going to see it right here in the bottom. What's the accuracy? So great question. So I do keep track of this. I've done this for 19 years. Our 19-year accuracy is about 66%. So about 2/3 of the time, roughly, we get it right. And remember, I'm not talking about the bold prediction, the exact amounts. We're just looking above and below average. And that's a little easier to do because you're not trying to forecast a specific temperature or amount. You're just trying to see where are you in comparison over a 3-month period compared to above and below average. A lot of people think short term, like it's cold today. It feels like it's cold the whole time. They forget all the warm days. You got to add them all up. And at the end of the season, you look at it and say, hey, this is like a football season. It's not one play or a single quarter. It's the whole season. So after the season's over, you look at your final record and about 66% of the time we get it right, which is, better than the Farmer's Almanac, which is, people that will never know. So it's a great, great question. I think a lot of times people think when I see this question, I think you can't forecast the high temperature 3 months from now on a single day at a single time. But you can say over a 3-month period, is it going to be above average or below average? That's a little bit easier to do. So Mark, great question here. I hope you are wrong and we get more snow. I know you're a predictor and not Guy, but I appreciate your knowledge. Yeah, that's the awful thing. I saw one of the first comments when we posted the stream was like, Brad, I want you to forecast more snow. Hey, here's the thing. I love snow. I don't make any bones about that, but I like being right more. So my goal is to try to be as accurate as possible. But you're right. I don't control things. Mother Nature is in complete control. God is in complete control. I am in sales. I am not in production in this case. So we'll do the best we can to give you the best forecast. But remember, it's not about what we want or what I want. It's about what could happen based on the setup in the atmosphere. But that's a great question. A lot of folks hoping for snow. And that's the one thing I will tell, even though we're going to be near average this year, the thing to get excited for is I do not see a scenario where we're going to get 0 snow this year. It just looks very unlikely based on the storm track. And that's a high confidence forecast as well, because if we've only had 1 year in 145 years with 0, and it was last year, the odds are definitely in our favor that we're going to get at least something this upcoming winter. What's the average high and low? Well, it depends on the month. As you go from December, the average high, I'm going to see if I have my winter, I'll pull up my winter averages here to kind of show you. The averages start in the low 60s and they fall to the coldest part of the winter is in January and February, when the average highs are in the 50s and the average lows drop into the 30s. But the thing about it is that like I said, the average high temperature in the coldest part of winter here is around 51, 52. That's why a high in the 40s is actually pretty low. So let me bring that up. That's a great question. I'm gonna my winter graphic here real quick because I do have the winter temperatures. I'll pop it in right here, bring it up full screen so you can see it. So climatological seasons, I know we get a lot of confusion on this sometimes, are the full 3 months. So you can see the average high on December 1st is 58 degrees. By December 15th, the average high is 55. And by the first of the year, this is the coldest stretch of weather, basically from about January 1st to the beginning of February, the average high is in the low 50s, 51, 52. And then look at this, by the end of February 28th or 29th in leap year, the average high is all the way back up to 60. Now, the average lows here are generally in the 30s, and right here they fall into the low 30s. So those are your averages. And again, if you average it out for the whole winter, the average temperature here is about 44.1 for the entire winter season. So that's when we're comparing averages above and below. That's why cold rain in 40s can still get you below average, but not produce snow. But that's a great question. What month would you say is the best chance of getting snow? Well, funny you should say. I actually have another graphic here that will help you out. Our snowiest time of the year is not December. I think everybody wants to see snow around Christmas. Man, who doesn't? But the snowiest month overall is January because it's the coldest and it's one of the longest months. But the snowiest time of the year is actually late February, early March, if you break it down by days in a week. So in the snowiest day, calendar day, which means what day of the year has the most snow fallen on Charlotte? Believe it or not, it's March 2nd. More snow has fallen on that single date than any other date of the year. And if you think about the pattern, you typically get cold air and the active spring storm tracks start lining up late in the season. So if you want to see big snow around here, it's usually later in the season as opposed to earlier. So my son lives in Banner Elk. Oh, I popped that one up real quick, guys. So my son lives in Banner Elk. Travels over to App State daily. I hope all-wheel drive is good enough. Thanks. Yeah, all-wheel drive. I mean, the mountains are great. They do a good job of keeping those roads clear, especially 105 if you're going between Banner Elk and App State. But I will say this year, if you were up in the mountains last year, it was not a very good winter. It was not very snowy. This year could be completely different. So I would definitely be prepared for more snow, cut more wood, be ready for more snowfall this year than we've had the last couple of years. So another question coming up here. Let's see. Blizzard of 93. What year did it happen? Blizzard of 93, remember, wasn't really a blizzard outside of the mountains. That was in March too. I believe that was a neutral year. And that was kind of a weird storm. That was kind of an anomaly. It really had nothing to do with El Nino or La Nina. It was just a massive storm system. And that still holds the state record for most snow up at Mount Mitchell of like 55 inches of snow. So that was definitely one of those years. Someone asked earlier about snow. I finally found my graphic about when it snows, and you could see the percentage. From a percentage standpoint, January actually averages more snow, but if you add up the totals and divide it by the months where it snows, February ends up being 32.5% of all our snow is fallen in that month, which is crazy to think because it's also the shortest month of the winter at 28 or 29 days. So it's much shorter. So that means more snow falls per day than it does in January, even though January averages a little bit more over the last 30 years. So great question. Any snow thoughts on Asheville? So Asheville's an interesting thing. I've talked about this during the fall leaf season. Asheville actually has a very dry climate. It's actually much warmer in Asheville than the mountains around. So in Asheville, they average something closer to like what Hickory would get, 7 to 10 inches. So in the city of Asheville, you tend to not get as much snow as you do in the surrounding mountains. The elevation there is somewhere around 2,700 feet, but the mountains around are 3,500 feet and higher. So, but I do expect, because of that active storm track, and again, I try to include all the Carolinas in this map. You can see Asheville is in my below average temperature outlook, and it's also in my above average snowfall. So I would expect to see above average snowfall and below average. So in general for Asheville, that's what I would expect. So great question. Last one. So hey, Brad, Panovich, we're anticipating rain, sleet, ice instead of snow this year. That's always the toughest call. I will go back to my summary graphic here, where I do have ice near average. I will tell you, I think ice threat is a little bit higher than we've seen recently because of the storm track along the coast. There's more opportunities for shallow cold air to get trapped against the mountains. And because of that warm air over the Atlantic, that marine air, we call it a warm nose, that warm nose can come in and override the cold air at the surface and does give you more potential for ice. You know, the hardest thing around here sometimes is the potential for what type of wintry weather, because, you know, the variables are much greater for winter weather. You know, rain versus no rain is an easier answer than is it going to be rain, sleet, or snow, because you're not talking about worrying about the temperature for rain. You just know it's going to be rain. In the wintertime, you got to worry about the temperature at the surface at 3,000 feet, 5,000 feet, sometimes 10,000 feet. And the difference between rain and ice is a tenth of a degree. 32.0 is freezing, 32.1 is water. So, I mean, the difference between ice and snow is literally a tenth of a degree. And as good as we are at forecasting, as great as the tools we have, forecasting a tenth of a degree difference at a certain altitude can sometimes be incredibly difficult. I think we're sometimes a victim of our own success. The fact that there's even a chance for wintry weather and we know days ahead of time gets lost in the fact that we don't get the precise amount. And we lose the fact that we actually forecasted wintry weather 5 days ahead of time. And it fell, but maybe it didn't fall as much as we thought. So that's always something to keep in the back of your mind. And that reminds me of our forecasting rules as we get into the winter season, as we wrap this up. You know, when we get towards a time where we could have wintry weather, these are my rules we go by. I don't put out long-range snowfall maps. They're useless. They're not going to happen. If you see those on social media, trust me, it's completely bogus. What we do 7 to 10 days out, you look for pattern recognition. Is it favorable for wintry weather somewhere in the southeast? That's really all you can say at that time range. You can't talk about specifics. You can't talk about amounts. You just say, hey, we've got a storm and cold air that could sync up in the 7 to 10 day period. Once we get 5 to 7 days out, I'll probably start talking about, hey, that trend for potential is going up or it's going down. That's what you do in the 5 to 7 day range. Now, 3 to 5 days out, timing and the type of storm. Is it going to be ice, sleet, or snow? That's in the 3 to 5 day range, depending on the confidence in the forecast. Remember, it's all about confidence. Sometimes you have a lot better information and sometimes you don't. And then 1 to 3 days out, forecast details, amount, location, and timing. Those are the rules I live by, and they're really the most accurate way to talk about wintry weather. You can't put, you know, the horse in front of the cart, right? You got, or the cart in front of the horse, I should say. And that would work, actually. Put the cart in front of the horse here. So oftentimes we try to do it like this. We call it a forecast funnel. We start very broad, and as we get closer to the event, we narrow in to what we're talking about. So those are the rules we go with as we get closer to this winter season. And trust me, we'll have a winter event to talk about at some point this upcoming season. So as always, if you did not get your question in or you have other ones, throw them in the comments. I can't guarantee I'll get to them right now, but I'll try to get to them through the next 24 hours, go through the comments on our various platforms and try to answer as many as possible. And as always, make sure you're following us at WCNC.com, on air, online, and social media. If you're not following me at WXBrad on social, great place. We'll post our vlogs there. Our Weather IQ YouTube channel is a great resource. We've got a lot of information there. If you go to that channel, you'll hear about all the different ways that winter weather can form. Our team does an amazing job there. That's also exclusively where you'll see my vlogs as well if you want to get updates on wintry weather. So hope you enjoyed this year's winter weather outlook. We'll see how things unfold. If you have a guess on how much snow we're going to see, throw them in the comments. It's always fun to be some great competition. We know we're probably all going to be wrong at the specific amounts, but it is fun to talk about snow as we're a week ahead here of Thanksgiving. Have a great day, everybody, and I'll see you on air starting at 4, 5, 6, and 11 right here on WCNC Charlotte.